Okay. Good morning to many friends and supporters of the Wilson Center, and I'm sure that there are many watching this on streaming video. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and in case you haven't heard the breaking news, last week the Wilson Center moved up the global think tank ratings for the 5th year in a row, hitting number 9 in the world. And we took home the top prize in a brand new category called transdisciplinary research that honors the kind of conversation we're going to have today. In the 21st century, think tanks need to be agile. They have to be ready to leap across sectors and silos to get at the urgent issues, like the rule of law and anti-corruption, fights that cross borders, efforts that will take the best of both the private and public sectors. With that in mind, it's my pleasure to welcome my very good friend of long standing, the Honorable Mark Wolf, Senior Judge on the Federal District Court for Massachusetts. You might know him from the Whitey Bulger case, or from the corruption charges against former Massachusetts Speaker of the House, Salvatore De Masi. But before that, he was a deputy U.S. attorney and chief of the Public Corruption Unit following stints at the Department of Justice. I know him from our days as Harvard Law School students and in private practice decades ago. And we are absolutely thrilled that Judge Wolf is here today to help launch the Wilson Center's new Rule of Law initiative. After his remarks, he will join a panel that includes some of the best experts on this issue from the Wilson Center and beyond, and the discussion will continue. They'll be introduced later, but I want to offer a shout out to my dear friend, my additional daughter, Sarah Chase, whose book, Thieves of State, is one of the best things you can read about this issue, and not just because it mentions me and our time together in Afghanistan. I'd also like to recognize our own Will Pomerantz, Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute, who will moderate the conversation, and Governor John Engler, a recovering politician like me, who heads the Business Roundtable. He and I are proof that bipartisanship is alive and well, except on Capitol Hill. So thanks, John, for being such a fantastic partner to the center. One final comment. Combating grand corruption ain't for sissies. It's an industrial strength problem. It topples some governments, think Ukraine, and it hobbles others. Well, think Ukraine. It has a public and private sector dimension, and the rule of law is key to creating and restoring good governance and good business. In short, it's a big deal, and so is Judge Mark Wolf. Please join me in welcoming him now.
I'd like to thank Jane, who does have to go see the President of Colombia, for that very generous introduction. If my father, who unfortunately passed away in 1998 while I was conducting 9 months of hearings in the Bulger case, were here, he would have liked it. If my 97-year-old mother, who's still hanging on, were here, she would have believed it. So I have to figure out how to stream this for her. But anyway, thank you very much. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to collaborate with the Woodrow Wilson Institute in launching its new Rule of Law initiative. And I particularly enjoyed working with Will Pomerantz on this. When Jane and I were at the Harvard Law School, the acclaimed Yale constitutional scholar Alexander Bickel gave the very prestigious Oliver Wendell Holmes lecture. And I remember he said, it's a great honor to give the Oliver Wendell Holmes lecture, but it's an honor that one would rather receive than endure. And obviously I remembered that. Now I think I'm beginning to understand it, because it's an honor to be speaking here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. But it's also, in view of the qualifications of the panel, somewhat daunting. Brackett Denniston, who just retired as the general counsel of General Electric, and I worked together his prosecutors in the District of Massachusetts. He headed the white-collar crime unit when I was the Deputy United States Attorney and headed the public corruption unit. He did that courageously. He had the Church of Scientology literally after him, day after day, for several years as a result of that work. I quote Sarah Shays, whom I've not met before, when I speak all over the world. Her recent book, Thieves of State, as Jane said, and her other work is really, to me, the most powerful and persuasive description of how what's coming to be called grand corruption, the abuse of public office by a nation's leaders for personal gain, has devastating effects on national and international security, and gives real urgency to the topic that we'll all be discussing today. Frank Vogel is a visionary founder of Transparency International. Governor Engler heads the Business Roundtable. I noticed that Governor Engler has the chief executive officer of the Floor Corporation on his board. Mr. Seaton also heads the Partnering Against Corruption initiative of the World Economic Forum, which I've addressed. I'm, in some respects, the amateur in this group, although not an amateur with regard to matters of public corruption in the United States, but in the international arena. I've long believed, as I was taught in college, that wise men should not, and we were all men when I was at a particular college, wise men should not confuse oversimplification for clarity. And as a result, especially since becoming a judge, I've rarely been pithy. After conducting those 9 months of hearings in the Bulger case that caused me to discern and describe tremendous corruption between the Federal Bureau of Investigation, its high echelon organized crime informants, James Whitey Bulger and Stevie Flemmi, I wrote a 661-page decision. It was quickly turned into New York Times bestseller, Black Mass, and now it's a movie I haven't seen of the same name with Johnny Depp. Although I couldn't get through, I understand the whole 661 pages. It doesn't get to the courtroom drama. But today I will, at the risk of oversimplifying, try to quickly state the case that I made initially at greater length in a Brookings Institution article, if it's all right to say Brookings Institution here, and in a Washington Post op-ed piece advocating the creation of an international anti-corruption court to deal with grand corruption. This would be, in my current conception, a court separate from, but similar to the existing International Criminal Court. There are significant, I'm sure, questions, nuances, details. I hope they'll emerge, and I'll have a chance to discuss some of them in the panel discussion. But to state it as simply as I'm able to, at least, grand corruption is coming to be a common term. Colloquially, it's the abuse of public office for private gain by a nation's leaders. It's endemic in many countries, including many countries in which I've worked over the years, in Egypt, in China, in Russia, in Turkey, for example. Grand corruption has devastating consequences. It's extremely costly. For example, it's reliably estimated that more than 10 times what is given in development aid in developing countries is lost to corruption in those same countries. And it's not just an issue for developing countries. The World Bank has said that Russia loses 43% of its GDP to its corrupt shadow economy. Sarah, I hope, will explain this at greater length and certainly much better than I can. This grand corruption has very dangerous consequences for national and international security. Terrorist regimes, such as those in Afghanistan, provide havens for terrorists, and indeed, indignation at corruption breeds terrorists. A substantial portion of the constituency for Boko Haram, not people animated by religious fundamentalism, but by an abhorrence of the corruption of the previous administration, at least, the Good Luck Jonathan administration in Nigeria. And that corruption frustrates the United States' ability to strengthen the Nigerian army to fight Boko Haram. Because again, at least until recently, if we were to give $100 million to Nigeria to strengthen the army, only a tiny fraction of that would be used for its intended purpose, and maybe not to buy equipment of suitable standards anyway. As is increasingly being recognized, there's a very direct correlation between the countries that are most corrupt at the highest levels and those where the leaders are most abusive of the human rights of their citizens. Virtually a direct correlation on the indices. And I found when I was a prosecutor of corrupt public officials in the United States, it was necessary to explain to juries, among others, that corruption is not a victimless crime. That's a dangerous illusion that many people may have. For example, the victims of corruption are frequently and most obviously, the poor and the powerless. A year ago, almost to this day, I was speaking at Harvard Law School on this subject, and in the newspaper, big article about how Liberia could not account for a large portion of the funds that had been urgently sent there to fight Ebola. Nicholas Kristof had a series of pieces in the New York Times last year about Angola. Just to give you one example, he reported that Angola has the highest percentage of children under 5 who don't live to the age of 5 of any country in the world. And in the same articles, he's reporting on the leader's daughter, who's a billionaire, paying $2,000 a bottle for champagne and flying her literally jet-setting friends in from around the world for the most lavish birthday party for herself. It's evident that, I think, that the poor and the powerless are vulnerable. They don't get health care, they don't get education. It's just wrong. What's not as evident is that major businesses, honest, ethical businesses, are also victims of corruption, particularly grand corruption. Because in my experience, American businesses particularly tend to be far more ethical than their competitors, and they've got good reason to be. Until the UK got into this arena a couple years ago, American businesses were the only ones who faced the credible threat of criminal prosecution under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act for paying bribes abroad. And I sat a couple years ago in the ambassador's home in Prague with Danny Roderick, the CEO of Westinghouse. And Westinghouse was competing, in effect, with the Russian Federation for a contract to provide nuclear facilities for all of the Czech Republic, which would have, as a practical matter, given them the contracts for all of Central and Eastern Europe once they had that base. And they had developed a transparent scorecard. How was each side doing? They were way ahead. And Danny Roderick was nevertheless concerned that demand for bribes would be made, and indeed that the Russian Federation was bribing the officials with whom they had long relationships to get the contract. And he said, I really want to get this contract, but we're not going to pay a bribe. He said, I was trained by Brackett Denniston at General Electric, and I was educated to understand that this was not just wrong, it's dumb, and we won't do it. But that puts honest American companies and honest ethical other companies at a tremendous disadvantage around the world. And it injures the people who would benefit from the good work that they would do and get shoddy work instead. Indignation at corruption is something recent, and I think is why the proposal I've made is quickly generated attention around the world and at certain high levels in our government in the United States, led by young people in, say, Egypt and Ukraine, young people who don't accept is an inevitable way of life that corruption and grand corruption has to be tolerated, endured, are going to the streets, overthrowing governments and demanding good government. In the process, they're destabilizing not only their own countries, say again, Egypt, Ukraine, but the world. I mean, the Maidan protests lead to the flight of Yanukovych, leading, of course, to Russia going into Crimea, fundamentally changing, at least for now, the relationship and the potential of the relationship between the United States and Russia, say to deal with Syria. This indignation at grand corruption is creating grave dangers to international peace and security, which is what the United Nations exists to address. In my view, it's not possible to deal with the consequences of high-level corruption after the fact. It's essential to do something to deter it. And what we rely on in the United States to deter corruption is the credible threat of criminal prosecution, that corrupt officials will be investigated, they'll be prosecuted, they'll be convicted, and they'll be punished. But in these countries characterized by grand corruption, there is a culture of impunity. 177 nations have signed the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. In it, they have undertaken a solemn obligation to have laws that make criminal bribery, extortion, money laundering, obstruction of justice. And they've also undertaken in that convention and others a duty to enforce those laws in good faith, including against their leaders. But those laws are not enforced in many, many countries because the corrupt leaders control law enforcement, control the courts, and won't permit the investigation, prosecution, and punishment of their friends, their colleagues, and often their families and themselves. Until about 2 years ago, 18 months ago, I was working closely with some wonderful judges who headed the Judicial Training Academy of Turkey. They were dedicated to training prosecutors and judges to be more skillful, to be more honest, to be more independent, and they were making progress. One of the prosecutors developed essentially indictments, corruption cases of members of the then Prime Minister, now President Erdogan's cabinet. And Prime Minister Erdogan urged them to resign. One of them publicly said, if we've got to resign, you need to resign too. And I don't commend the prosecutor for leaking evidence not presented in court, but the media got a tape recording that was alleged to be Erdogan telling his son how to get $10 million out of the house. Well, what happened? The prosecutor got removed. The people I was working in got removed and sent to inconsequential jobs in the provinces, and these prosecutions, investigations haven't proceeded. There are existing laws to address corruption, bribery of foreign officials. We have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We have its counterpart, because it's been a model for the OECD Convention Against Bribery, but only people and companies which pay bribes can be prosecuted under the FCPA or the laws enacted pursuant to the OECD Convention. Public officials can't be prosecuted. So when Daimler and Siemens in courts in Brooklyn admit that they paid bribes to Russian officials, among others, and agree to cooperate, and all of that evidence is sent to Russia in 2008 and 2010, and after some scolding by the activist Alexei Navalny, then Prime Minister Medvedev says, yes, we will prosecute these cases. In some instances, the public officials were named. We're now in 2016. None of these Russian officials have been prosecuted. So what I have been advocating is the enforcement of existing laws against corrupt public officials that would address the demand side of the equation and diminish the dilemma for honest, ethical companies. I believe what we need to do, as I said, is prosecute, punish corrupt public officials, in the process deter grand corruption, and create conditions, create openings where genuinely honest, able leaders can be elected, which is what these people who are going to the streets so effectively are urging. So there can be a change in culture that comes both from the bottom and from the top, which is what I think is ultimately required. The International Anti-Corruption Court that I advocate would have jurisdiction to prosecute and punish grand corruption like the existing International Criminal Court for certain human rights abuses. It would operate on a principle of complementarity. It could exercise its authority only with regard to leaders from a nation which did not have the capacity or will to investigate, prosecute meritorious cases itself. And essentially, this is the United States model. We in the United States don't rely on local district attorneys to prosecute corrupt state and local officials. It's almost always done in federal courts, as it was done with Governor Robert McDonnell in Virginia, and Jane mentioned the case of the former Speaker of the House of Massachusetts Representatives, in which I presided and sentenced the Speaker of the House to 8 years in prison for extorting bribes in connection with $20 million of computer contracts in 2011. We don't rely on the district attorneys because frequently the state laws are not adequate. The investigators don't have the sophistication to make the cases, and the district attorneys are part of the political establishment. The appointed, presidentially appointed U.S. attorneys are not. The idea, the belief that effective enforcement of the criminal law against high-level foreign officials is not the idiosyncratic idea of one wandering judge. Secretary Kerry gave what I believe is a brilliant talk on this subject at Davos on just January 22nd, a short time ago. He said, "We have to acknowledge in all quarters of leadership that the plagues of violent extremism, greed, lust for power, sectarian exploitation often find their nourishment where governments are fragile and leaders are incompetent or dishonest. And that is why the quality of government is no longer a domestic concern. And I say to all of you who are business people, who engage in the politics of one country or another and support people in them, you need to demand accountability from those potential leaders or existing leaders." Then he went on to say, "I used to be a prosecutor, and I know how hard it is to hold people in positions of public responsibility accountable, but I also know how important it is." The International Anti-Corruption Court that I've suggested has quickly gained substantial support around the world. It's supported by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, who was instrumental in the creation of the International Criminal Court. It's endorsed by Congressman Jim McGovern, the co-chair of the Lantos Human Rights Commission of the House of Representatives, the chairman of Transparency International, Jose Ugaz, supports this and has said I'm authorized to say that Transparency International does too. Human Rights Watch has endorsed it. Global Witness and Global Parliamentarians Against Corruption have endorsed it. Global Witness was the source of the very powerful 60 Minutes piece about hiding beneficial ownership in the United States that aired several days ago. And leading international prosecutors like Justice Richard Goldstone from South Africa, Luis Moreno Ocampo from Argentina also support this idea. And very importantly to me, and for the long-range prospects of this proposal, which is a long-range proposal, it is inspiring to young people from around the world. Between Christmas and New Year's, by way of example only, I received the most gratifying emails from young lawyers, each under 30, most under 25, about how inspired they are by this and our association. Gregory Vipan from Moscow, who won the very prestigious Jessup International Moot Court competition a few years ago, Chi-Chi Wei from China, Olga Senchuk from Ukraine, Vikram Hugel from India, and some of those young people are here with me today. Christina Migiani from Malta, and Rory Rosenblith, who is indigenous and not even a lawyer, at least yet. But this is something that captures the imagination and dedication of people who are, young people who are frustrated and determined to fight against corruption. The suggestion is, I acknowledge, bold and controversial. As I've gone around and talked, I haven't heard anybody really dispute the devastating consequences of grand corruption as I've described them to you. And I would say that because of these consequences, the energetic efforts that are going on by organizations and individuals, and there are more of them than I thought I would find in this space, are admirable but inadequate. The argument against what I've proposed that I most often hear, the arguments are two on a high level. One, this is an impossible ideal. And two, it'll distract attention from more achievable initiatives. To that, I briefly respond that the International Anti-Corruption Court is compatible with the initiatives that Transparency International, Global Witness, the United States government, and others are advocating, for example, to increase the transparency of beneficial ownership. But transparency is not a goal in itself. Accountability is the goal. In the United States, when corruption is revealed, say, by the media, we have law enforcement that will follow up, investigate if appropriate, prosecute, and usually prevail. Those institutions don't exist in most countries in the world. With regard to impossibility, I know I'm in Washington, D.C., which is probably the world capital of cynicism these days. And this, some people might characterize as naive. In my lexicon, there's a distinction between being naive and being idealistic. But Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it's done. And my judicial hero, Louis D. Brandeis, years ago, similarly said, most of the things worth doing in the world had been declared impossible before they were done. I'm old enough to have seen seemingly impossible things occur. The fall of apartheid in South Africa, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I hope I don't have to live to be 97 like my mother to see the creation of this court, but I believe that there are people in this room who will see it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Judge Wolf, for that really very provocative and interesting lecture. which opens up a lot of discussion, and discussion as to both the ideals and the practicalities of all that Judge Wolf has put on the table. And we have with us today really a very distinguished panel that's going to address Judge Wolf's presentation and also kind of bring in their own experiences and knowledge to add extra kind of discussion and weight to what we've heard already. I hope most of you picked up the bios of our distinguished panel, so I'm not going to go through long bios as we begin our discussion, but I think we're just going to jump right in and, again, discuss the implications of what Judge Wolf has to say on an international level and on a practical level. And I'm going to begin by posing a question to Governor Engler. We've talked during this, Judge Wolf mentioned about the cost of business, and he gave that very interesting quote from John Kerry about the role that business has to play in promoting accountability around the world. And as head of a major business organization, how do you see the role of the Business Roundtable and more broadly the question of the costs of corruption in doing business globally?
Well, I think the costs are very real, and they come at a price of U.S. competitiveness. In effect, we lose out when, just as the example you used, or the judge used of the Westinghouse CEO worrying about is that contract going to be fairly decided. It is absolutely the case, again, as the judge pointed out, that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is a risk factor when you're doing business. You have the rules of the road laid out for the American competitor anywhere in the world, and the risk of non-compliance is severe. And yet, in those markets, we are advocates for going out and negotiating trade deals. We'd like to have more exchange of goods. We'd like to be able to see markets opened up. But when they're opened up and there is no fundamental fairness, there's corruption, grand corruption, you lose out. And this is a great concern. Brackett can speak, much more eloquently because of his experience with GE, but I'm the generalist up here. I probably don't belong here. Jane's very kind to have me, but I would say that as we look at what are barriers to economic growth, the other point of this, as this money is siphoned out of economies, that deprives those markets of the opportunity both to meet the demands of their consumers and to have the kind of infrastructure investments and the other investments that would lift people out of poverty. Some of those investments would be in goods and services that might be the product being offered by a General Electric or a Caterpillar or any number of the members of the Business Roundtable. So it's not just what the company loses, it's that opportunity, as has been said, for the citizens in those countries to have a better life, to move up.
From your perspective, to what extent then does business feel this added responsibility when they go abroad and to address these types of issues?
Well, we're very clear. I had a wonderful example. I was in Romania back just a couple of years ago, and listening to Romanians, and at the time, oil and gas prices were a little bit different than they are today, but you had two major companies in the U.S., one involved in offshore exploration, another trying to do gas exploration onshore. And they were being blocked at every turn by Russian interests who had an interest in not seeing additional supplies of gas coming on the market when that was a market they were supplying. And it was interesting, the lengths to which they would intervene behind the scenes, and the Romanians were explaining how this worked. I mean, the Russian Gazprom had actually, well, allegedly, we'll say, interests favorable to that company. Behind the scenes, it even acquired ownership of television station so they could cover the story, and in this case it was enhanced recovery, or fracking as we might call it in this country. So they were running stories about the risk. They were then paying protesters. In one case, some had even a religious affiliation, and they were using old images of Romanian history to kind of try to alarm the populace that this investment should not go forward and it should not be permitted. I mean, and the company is in the position of trying to speak out, trying to do things the right way, but being checked at every turn. And so I think the proposal that's on the table today is fascinating because it helps to remedy the grand corruption when it occurs. We have also a sort of corrupt environment that we're often dealing in, where it's hard to have a way to document and to speak out what's going on. You know, you can feel it. You know it's happening, and it is so different than this country, where I can tell you, 12 years as a governor in Michigan, we were fortunate. We had no issues that arose, but I saw in legislative leaders, speakers of the House around the country, people close to governors, where the temptation was too much. We saw it in Detroit recently, and this was a federal prosecution, a very courageous federal prosecutor, and unveiled really a whole series of corruption that had been going on, and you could see in how many services had been deprived or how many services had been overcharged to the very citizens of the city. Well, multiply that, as has been done in the talk today, country after country and population all over the world. It's a very serious issue. Business can speak out, but we do need the public institutions to exist so there's a forum where business can go. Business by itself can merely speak out and end up, if it is a corrupt environment, that's the quickest way to be showing the exit.
Right. Moving to you, Brackett, we've raised the question of the idealism behind Judge Wolf's presentation, but you are the practitioner on the panel. And I thought maybe you can address some of the underlying issues that you faced as corporate counsel when confronting issues of corruption. And not only kind of the underlying conditions as a practitioner, but also kind of the broader conventions that are applied in these individual countries, and to what extent they have impact in the day-to-day practice of law around the world.
Well, Will, GE does business in about 140 countries. There's almost no place that you can't do business if you run your shop well, and I'll come back to that. So it's not impossible. That said, there are places that are very, very difficult. Russia, we've talked about. I always say Russia's the hardest place in the world to do business. Angola, which Mark referred to, we do business in Angola, and we know the same officials that you're talking about. We manage to do that business, but it is enormously, enormously hard to navigate those places. For business, growth is the most important thing that you want to encourage. Companies or economies that are growing, they foster business. I once heard in a conversation with two of my colleagues in the general counsel world, the former general counsel of Microsoft, the current general counsel, Brad Smith, and we were talking about anti-corruption efforts, and they told me this story about a question that Bill Gates was asked. You know that his passionate objective is the eradication of poverty. And somebody in an audience at one point asked him, what's the greatest cause of poverty? He answered, the rule of law. The rule of law, because it most, and corruption, because it most retards a country's growth. To what Governor Engler said and to what Mark said, it's just fundamental, and it's therefore fundamental to business. So how do companies navigate that? We long ago at GE said, we know our competitors bribe, and our largest competitors in certain sectors have all had FCPA cases since that occurred, but we're not going to do it. We're simply not going to do it, and we're going to address it as if it's a competitive advantage. And so most people knew very well, because that was our tone, that we wouldn't bribe. And I've heard dozens of stories from GE business people. They come back and say, oh, you're the company that doesn't bribe. So you can do it, but it needs a lot of help. Number one, you have to have culture change in your own place. The leaders have to own it, speak it, emphasize it. So you've got to create a culture of integrity and make people accountable for it. Number two, you've got to, you're an imperfect city. All businesses are imperfect cities. You're going to hire people who do bad things. You've got to have mechanisms to detect them. Audit staffs, ombud systems that people can speak out and raise concerns, and that saves us more trouble and saves good businesses more trouble than anything. And thirdly, you've got to have mechanisms to punish wrongful behavior and disclose to the government, when you've had misses. We regularly, routinely go to the Department of Justice when we have misses, and we do have misses, and we tell them everything. And that has served us well in developing a relationship and in navigating those 140 countries. Now, that said, you need a lot of help. And businesses, as Governor Engler said, are advocates in some places for anti-corruption efforts. But I'd say they're way too scattered and way too ineffective. Big business, yes, there's been a lot of progress. If you go back to 1973, there was no FCPA. There were no prosecutions until basically after 2000. There were no big companies that were snared until after 2000, when people like Siemens and others finally got nailed. So enforcement had to take its place in all that. But where were the European companies? Where are the Chinese companies? Has anybody seen a Chinese company advocating for anti-corruption efforts? When have you seen a Russian company advocate for it? You haven't. There are scatters. There's great companies in Brazil who've been advocates for this, including Embraer. But there are lots of companies in Brazil that weren't, and we're seeing the consequences of that. So companies of all kinds and all places have to be better advocates for this and advocates for enforcement. Because enforcement, as Mark said, turns the tide. It turns the tide along with culture change and along with popular revulsion. So look at Brazil. No one would have thought 2 years ago that you would have a complete culture change. Why did it happen? Tough prosecutors investigating and prosecuting. So that's how to address it. You got to have law change. You got to take care of your own culture. You got to be open.
That's a good segue to Sarah and to Frank here. So we've talked about the business side of this, but I would be interested to hear, we'll start with Sarah, kind of from the bottom-up approach and this question of culture and changing culture. And
Maybe if it's bottom-up approach within corrupt countries, I think
Then
Frank is the guy to talk about.
Okay. Then we'll start with Frank on that question.
But I've learned everything from Sarah.
I think we'll let both of you will be able to address that issue.
Thank you. First of all, I want to congratulate Mark Wolf. This is a great idea. And why is it a great idea? It's not just for all the reasons that Mark explained. It's a great idea because it can help to focus attention on a discussion about impunity. We in Transparency International have the goal of no impunity as the number one priority in our strategy for the next 4 years to 2020. But when you talk about just impunity, frankly, everybody falls asleep. If you talk about some great idea like, let's create a new court, then it concentrates the mind, it creates the discussion. I frankly think that it's very important, and the issue of culture is the most overrated issue in any discussion about corruption. There's nothing cultural about stealing. And when it comes to grand corruption, we are talking about stealing tens of millions of dollars. You don't change a culture that suddenly from one day or another says, let's stop stealing tens of millions of dollars. We are talking in Mark's context about grand corruption, about the corruption, the theft of public goods by very high-level officials, the big villains. And there, it's not a cultural issue. It's a question of opportunity. It's a question of people twisting the laws. And in Transparency International, we have about 100 national chapters. We have thousands of members. And we are trying very hard from the base upwards to create the systems of justice that can allow somehow that you get change of government, that you can change the rules, that you can get decent rule of law. But I have to make a very important point here. This is a dangerous game. And the more successful my colleagues in national chapters are in bringing these issues to the fore, the more they're being intimidated. Some are being imprisoned. A colleague of ours in Rwanda was murdered last year by the police for investigating police corruption. The space of freedom of expression and freedom of assembly for civil society is narrowing. If you look at the papers today about Malaysia, as the Prime Minister gets away with massive corruption, he would be a perfect target for your court, Mark. As he gets away with massive corruption, so the government is clamping down on freedom of the press. Journalists are getting imprisoned. Very important journalists, by the way, are being gagged and so on. So culture, yes, maybe it's important. But let me just say to you, if you look at what's happened in banking in the last few years, they've lost their moral compass. And it's happened in the United States. We're not so pure as we might want to imagine. There is a culture that is serving itself against integrity in too many parts of business and not just in government. But around the world, I want to emphasize how important Mark's initiative is, not because Transparency International supports all of the details of his plan, nor because we are making it our highest priority, but it fits so well with the issue of integrity, and it fits so well with the issue of impunity. And let me make one final little point. Our discussion should focus on grand corruption because that's Mark's subject. But because you said bottom up, there are millions of victims of corruption. Every time you see an FCPA prosecution under the Justice Department, the one thing that's missing in all those papers is there's no mention of the victims. It's as if the crime is victimless, but Mark said it wasn't, and of course it isn't. We've had far too few companies who've willingly settled with the Justice Department on FCPA, but never mentioned how they regret having done so much damage to the lives of ordinary citizens around the world. This needs to change. Finally, just one last point. As you think about the law, in most countries, laws pertaining to corruption deal with the exchange of money, the extortion of money, the extortion of bribes. But just remember that when it comes to petty corruption, not grand corruption, there are thousands and thousands of women and girls whose lives are being ruined because people in power are asking sexual favors from them rather than money. This form of sextortion is a form of corruption that gets no attention whatsoever. It's not even really attacked by the major women groups around the world, and yet it should. And it's a culture of male supremacy, if you will, in so many countries where women and girls, particularly in poor countries, and poor women and poor girls, are the victims of sexual acts, sexual favors because of corruption. And I just wanted to put that as a footnote because you asked me about bottom up. Sorry to be on so long.
No problem.
And let me riff off of that one in particular, just to get from there. So this is just to riff a little bit on victims and how you get from victims to the security crises, right? So let's take that story and let me personalize it. Not to me, thank God. I'm talking with some Nigerian justice sector professionals in northern Nigeria, and we're talking about the mechanisms. How is money literally where in the system, where are the toll booths in the system? And a prosecutor interrupts the conversation and says, Sarah, you know, we've just been talking about money, but it's not just money. And he goes into a story about this, a woman whose husband was in pretrial detention, he's diabetic, she really wants him out of jail so she can provide his medications, guarantees he'll be back for trial, and the judge takes advantage of her. So as a female, obviously, and as Frank has suggested, that's extremely distressing. as a security professional, I next think about her brother. What does her brother want to do to the judge? He wants to shoot the guy, right? This is northern Nigeria. All he has to do is cross the street and someone's going to give him a gun or an IED to blow up the judge, right? I spent most of a decade in southern Afghanistan. There were some years in there where it was really difficult for a young, proud male not to join an insurgent group when he wanted to shoot a cop because the cop had shaken him down or smacked him in the face or whatever. And not only do they offer the opportunity, they offer the argument. And this is something that's really hard for us to wrap our heads around when we're watching ISIS chop people's heads off. The argument is a moral argument. It's the reason that judge is so depraved as to violate your sister is because he doesn't obey God. And if only we had a government that was regulated according to God's law, this wouldn't be like that. And I thought I heard right behind me, I was sitting there, and I thought I heard somebody say it's not true that Boko Haram used corruption that was part of the recruitment strategy for Boko Haram. I don't know who said that, but I heard somebody say, no, that's not true. I was just in Maiduguri listening to people who had been listening to the early preaching of Boko Haram. Literally in November, I was in the birthplace of Boko Haram. And they explicitly used the argument that the secular constitution of Nigeria is the reason why the police and the judges, et cetera, are behaving this way. And so that gets us, this individual victimization of corruption sufferers is what gets us both to violent extremism and to the revolutions that we saw in Ukraine, in the Arab Spring, et cetera. It's kind of two different ways of going after this government. Either you have a broad, widespread popular revolt, or you have a small, asymmetric, morally based or morally argued insurgency. That brings us to the role of businesses. And I think part of your question was, are businesses sort of seeing not just the bottom line, but let's think about how would you expand your notion of corporate social responsibility, right? If one can argue, which I think we all do, that the facilitation and enabling of kleptocratic structures by major businesses, I think the extractives are sometimes the most obvious ones. If that is helping drive some of the world's biggest security crises, then how might we think about expanding the whole notion of corporate social responsibility? The other thing I really love in the whole criminalizing framework of this conversation is it gets at another aspect of corruption as we're experiencing it today. And I think one of the reasons that the indignation is a relatively recent phenomenon is because we're looking at a different phenomenon in terms of corruption. There were always corrupt actors in governments as long as there's been government. But I think that since the 1980s, when you combine corrupt tendencies, globalization, and the ability to move money out of these countries, and frankly, an ideological shift toward the amassing of private wealth is a good thing. You know, there's a certain ideological, approbation of that. I think we're into a different space, and the corruption epidemic that we're seeing is a response to that. And one element of that I think the criminal language is important in raising is we are talking organized networks. They are vertically integrated in the sense that the money that's stolen at the bottom, the quote petty corruption that's stolen at the bottom, works its way up the chain. Secondly, it represents a gigantic revenue stream. It's not just oil or the big bribes taken from big industries. It's $2 to $4 billion a year in petty bribes in Afghanistan. That's one point. It's horizontally integrated. We are looking at networks that interweave public and private sector actors with criminals and occasionally with terrorists. That's really hard for a lot of decision makers to get their heads around and to map, because we have a tendency to think of public and private sector actors as basically licit and then criminals and terrorists over here as the bad guys. And these networks are fully interwoven, and criminal investigations and prosecutions under whatever type of framework that's done need to actually start taking account of that and mapping these networks accurately.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Wolf, do you have any initial comments?
Sure. One, Sarah wrote about these networks in her work, and it much deepened my understanding. But basically, she wrote, if I can paraphrase it, it's wrong to think that corruption is incidental to governing in Afghanistan. It is the purpose of government.
That's right.
Not to serve the people, but to be essentially what we would call in the United States a RICO enterprise.
Exactly.
I've had a lot of mafia cases. I've tried cases involving RICO enterprises. To conceive it this way is important because we wouldn't deal with a RICO enterprise in the United States through civil law alone or trying to get asset recovery. It's criminal, and you know that it's dangerous, and you need to punish it and deter it. Let me amplify a bit something that Frank talked about in shorthand. He talked about Malaysia. And while I try to put out a particular proposal, well, I do put out a particular proposal, there are many steps that are intermediate. On one hand, today I'm advocating essentially extraterritorial enforcement of law. But foreign enforcement of laws in foreign countries against public officials from another country are not, in terms of criminal law, always extraterritorial. So Malaysia, in August, it's reported that several $1 million are missing from the sovereign wealth fund of Malaysia, and at least $681 million, according to the Attorney General, is in the Prime Minister's personal bank account. So an investigation starts in Malaysia. The prosecutor, person in charge of it's appointed by the Prime Minister. You read the New York, this is BBC from a couple weeks ago. Malaysia's top prosecutor has cleared Prime Minister Najib Razak of corruption and long-running financial scandal. But then you read the New York Times just a couple days ago, it says, Swiss question use of Malaysian sovereign fund run by Prime Minister. Some of the money went to Switzerland. So this is somebody who's the Prime Minister enjoying the benefits of the culture of impunity in Malaysia. Person he appoints that I've investigated, no problem. The Swiss are investigating. And that's not extraterritorial. Part of this crime was committed, if there was a crime, in Switzerland. So there's that. I just throw it out there. There's increasing internationalization, but it's difficult for any one country. Almost 10 years ago, the British were investigating substantial evidence of bribes by BAE to Saudi princes for business in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi leaders, or one of them, speaks with Prime Minister Tony Blair at the time. And he says, if you don't stop that investigation, you're not getting any more oil. So they stopped the investigation. BAE was prosecuted in Brooklyn under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It's difficult because of political pressures, competing political considerations, sometimes for any one nation to do this itself. And it's a reason that favors some kind of international body that wouldn't be subject or as subject to the same pressures.
But Mark, if I could just add just one word on that. It also suggests that governments have to be held accountable when they don't go after things like this. I mean, most people would say the decision in the UK was completely wrong.
Well,
It was completely wrong in not holding them accountable. I don't think you would ever get away with that in the U.S., for example. I think that would be political suicide. And so demonstrating that those countries will suffer consequences when they do that, but also bearing in mind your point that extraterritorial mechanisms are still useful. Countries have to take care of business.
And Frank wants to.
Just two little points. One, Tony Blair didn't get away with it. The OECD went after him. The British law, as a result, was changed very substantially to become a much tougher anti-corruption law. That was the good thing of that.
The Saudis weren't prosecuted.
No, but the U.S. took up the case, took up exactly the same case to prosecute.
But not any of the public officials, because even U.S. law doesn't authorize that.
But 1 second. We never get the public officials. I mean, it's not just the Saudis. We never get them. Najib in Malaysia is being investigated right now by the FBI. It's not just by the Swiss and all this money. But at most, we will freeze a small portion of the money. We won't get the guys. Obiang in Equatorial Guinea has been investigated up and down. 350-page report by the Senate Investigations Committee on him and what he's been doing. He's still enjoying life and traveling everywhere. So your court is important because without something like this, these guys are going to get away with it. We have no mechanisms at all right now, none, to get the government villains. And by the way, naturally Mubarak is scot-free right now, and his money is being unfrozen. And as to, RICO cases, here's an ad. Transparency International is bringing out its major report on corruption in sport. FIFA is a RICO case. This is a criminal enterprise. So it's not just governments and it's not just business. We also have other.
Okay, Sarah, last word, and then we're going to throw it over to the audience.
Just love to jump in on that one in a couple of ways. One is that FIFA, what's so fascinating about FIFA is it does use this type of statutes which would allow to go from FCPA to the bribe taker. What's so interesting is that it's much more comfortable to go after sporting officials, and it's much more comfortable for Americans to go after soccer. Maybe we can get the Europeans to go after the NFL, since we're obviously incapable of doing that, right? But I would also just like to say it does happen in America. I mean, the then president of Afghanistan's brother, Mahmoud Karzai, is a U.S. citizen. I know the type of evidence that was delivered to the Second Circuit of New York, and nothing happened. I think that the issue of the sort of sovereign immunity, but that gets very, very broadened. The idea that, you don't go after a sitting. It's even pretty interesting that the great work of the kleptocracy unit in US DOJ, there was a wonderful case, $480-something million against a former ruler of Nigeria, and part of me said, great, you got the case, but Abacha's been dead for X number of years. It's not really deterrent. I guess, and this is where we get into the mechanism. I love the content of this conversation. I'm not entirely convinced that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but it's not just it's too much of an ideal. Special jurisdictions have not proven in the human rights arena to be particularly effective in either reversing, deterring, or remedying the crimes that they have been applied to. I did a lot of work in Bosnia on actually this. What has been the impact of the Yugoslavia Tribunal on the way things are done in Bosnia. It was interesting to watch Milosevic actually try to hide evidence of human rights abuses. That was the one piece of really clear evidence I got that there was some response by a potential suspect to the existence of a court like this. And he took bodies and actually took them out of Kosovo and buried them, threw them in rivers, buried them under roads in military installations in Serbia. But I'm not convinced that this mechanism will in fact remove the reticence to prosecuting sitting public officials.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. We're going to open the floor to questions. Some hands. We'll take this question right here then.
Yes, right here. And please, not long statements, direct questions to
Thank you.
individuals or to the panel as a whole.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Deirdre Lepin, and Sarah and Mark, it's me. I was the one who said it's not true about Boko Haram, and let me offer a clarification as to why I said that. I am a former scholar here at the Wilson Center, and during that time I was working on Nigeria as my topic. And the last 2.5 years I've been engaged for 12 months in northern Nigeria. So the Boko Haram, as was characterized as not ideological, but rather a reaction against the corruption of the former government of Nigeria, the government of Jonathan. Actually, Boko Haram was established in the 90s as a Salafist, strongly ideological movement by Mohammed Yusuf, who was extrajudicially killed in 2009. The movement has been highly ideological and religious in orientation, called itself the Nigerian Taliban, in fact, initially. And it is now multifaceted. Unfortunately, many of its members are just pure criminals, one would have to say. And there are a few ideological elements which seeks to establish a caliphate. They have pledged fealty to ISIS, and they see themselves as the West African Waliat of ISIS. And so this is a group that I would not suggest is an anti-corruption crusading movement. I think that it is a highly criminal and very ideologically driven organization.
So I don't disagree with anything that you just said, except with the distinction between ideology and a social justice or anti-corruption objective. Has anyone read the New Testament recently? I mean, the notion that religious ideology is some completely separate strand from anger and indignation at the corruption of local officials and a desire to change it by revolutionary means if need be. I mean, I just think that's exactly what a lot of religions are all about. And then secondly, certainly over a 10 to 15 year period of festering violence and ability for movements to be manipulated by various forces, I'm not saying that what Boko Haram is today is identical to the type of preaching that Mohammed Yusuf was doing when he was alive, but he was definitely centering his preaching around the corruption and abusive nature of the government.
Okay. Right here? Mm-hmm. Right here. Mm-hmm. Yes.
That aside, the word democracy is hardly mentioned. And
Democracy.
Yeah, I just got it.
Nigeria, democratic process ousts corrupt government, replaces it with an avowedly anti-corruption crusader, validation of democracy as an antidote to this problem. Malaysia, functioning democracy, you can argue about that, but I've studied Malaysia a long time, but argue that it is. And in this case, democracy functioning in Malaysia is in fact not.
Maybe can I have a quick? Can I have just a quick word on that? Transparency International, for those who don't know, released its newest global corruption perceptions index last week, and you'll see on that there are many countries perceived to be where governments are perceived to be highly corrupt that I think we would call democratic. The one that springs to mind most often in this kind of conversation is India. Corruption is absolutely massive, and it has a vibrant democracy. So I think you're absolutely right. Democracy per se is not enough. What gets us so worried is when you have democratic systems that gradually get subverted, as I think we're seeing in Turkey, as I think we're seeing in Malaysia, and that the more corrupt the regime is, the more intent it becomes on undermining democratic institutions and undermining democracy. And when I said keeping civil society safe and curbing, that's why I'm so concerned about that. So I don't think democracy alone is sufficient. Yes.
I agree democracy alone is not sufficient, but it does create, in certain circumstances, opportunities for genuinely honest people to be elected, to respond to the growing will of the people for honesty. It doesn't always happen. It hasn't, as far as I understand it, happened, say, in Ukraine recently. And I know that countries around the world are dramatically different than the United States, but when Brackett and I were in the United States Attorney's Office from 1981 to 1985, the public corruption unit I headed achieved more than 40 consecutive convictions against corrupt public officials. Many of them were close associates of the very powerful mayor of the city of Boston, Kevin White. He, to the surprise of many, but not to me for reasons I'll explain, abruptly decided he wasn't going to run for a fifth term. It wasn't as surprising to me because I knew that was the week the Internal Revenue Service officers working with me found $100,000 in cash going from his chief fundraiser to an account in the name of his elderly infirm mother and his wife, 11 checks, each under $10,000, where $10,000 checks would have to be reported to the Treasury Department. So now there's a vacancy in the mayor's office for the first time in 17 years, and the Boston Globe does a poll, and it says, what quality is most important to you in the new mayor? So about 10% say tough on crime, 15% say lower taxes, 20% say honesty. And the people of Boston essentially acted on that sense of priority for a generation. We had a mayor named Tom Menino. He certainly was controversial in many ways, but nobody felt he was corrupt or there was a culture of corruption in the city of Boston. If you essentially have a totalitarian regime and there are no openings for new elections, there's really no opportunity for that. It's impossible to prosecute and punish every corrupt public official. The ultimate goal is to contribute to a democratic process that will lead to leaders who want to change the culture, where for a period of time at least, genuine good government is also good politics. Again, that sounds, I'm sure, idealistic. Maybe someone would call it naive, but I do think you see in certain countries, including perhaps now Romania, examples that can work elsewhere for at least a period of time.
You know, I just add one other thing. I think a disturbing trend in the world is hijacking democracies that then become corrupt enterprises. Yeah. So look at Nigeria, Turkey, Sarah mentioned. Look at Russia. You have, I think, many examples of that are developing. And I think there's a parallel in U.S. history. We had many corrupt jurisdictions, many corrupt jurisdictions that were democratically elected, but they hijacked the system. And how do you get at that? That's a much harder problem to get at. If the democracy is manipulated, and again, sometimes it gets turned around. So you're seeing that in Brazil. You're seeing it a bit in Venezuela. That's another factor to bear in mind, it seems to me, and we got to worry about it in the anti-corruption world.
Let's take another question. Right here? Microphone's coming right here.
Mike wasn't in anyway, so.
Robert Schroeder with International Investor. I'm glad someone brought up the court of public opinion in this, because my question really is, often we see a top-down approach to this, and I commend the idea that we have to attack this on an international level. But we are seeing technologies that could be brought to play. I know a lot of you have chapter offices around the world, people who want to be whistleblowers, people, the ordinary citizens who are exposed to this kind of corruption. Small surveillance cameras, the idea to put it right on the internet immediately, bypassing the police authorities and others. Are we seeing more done to enable citizens to blow the whistle?
That's actually where I was going to jump in after Brackett. One of the problems with democracy being a cure in many of these countries is it doesn't function freely. In Russia, the conventional media is controlled by Putin. It's state-owned media, and people beholden to Putin, so people aren't informed. And then you have Alexei Navalny, a lawyer, using technology, essentially. So he's got a very flat organization, but the Russians for a while said they would publish their budgets publicly and all public tenders, and they reported that they spent a fortune to build this industrial complex in a remote area of Russia at a particular address. So somebody who lived near there and went by that address every day knew there was nothing there. He went and took a picture of it on his iPhone, sends it to Navalny. It becomes, to the extent it can be, something scandalous and disseminated to the media. So I think, in terms, because a fully informed public is important to making good decisions in any system that purports to be democratic, aspires to be democratic, technology can be a tremendous tool, resource.
Well, just a very quick answer to your question is yes. The Partnership for Transparency Fund, and Bill Cochran is here with the Barry Metzger Rule of Law Initiative, which is designed to help civil society in many countries build justice systems. PTF operates a system in Uganda using very, very simple technology where people in rural areas can directly complain about counterfeit medicines, can directly complain about being asked for bribes. We in Transparency International have created basically 60 advisory and legal advocacy centers around the world. We now have had over 200,000 complaints, most of them online. Many cases we're able to follow up. And that's how, in fact, if we're doing it, and if we didn't have technology, we just wouldn't be able to do that. And it's having an enormous positive effect.
I just would add one other word. I mean, I think what TI is doing in this area, I think, is groundbreaking and very, very important, profoundly important. But what also is profoundly important and needs more support is journalism. So one of the things we did at GE is that we funded a fellowship for a journalist to write on anti-corruption matters all over the world. Well, that's just a small start. There has to be a lot more support of that sort of groundbreaking journalism combined with legal protections, because it's dangerous to be a journalist in many of these places.
And on that point, in 1997, I helped the Independent Journalism Foundation to test an idea I had of training judges and journalists together. If you want to have courts that behave properly in a democracy, you need a media that will demand open proceedings, understand what's going on, and hold the judges accountable if essentially they're in the bag. Conversely, the media in the United States enjoys First Amendment rights to investigate, to express, and those types of rights are not recognized even legally in many countries, and then it is, as in Mexico, journalists are heroically exposing corruption and getting murdered. Sarah.
So here we are, we all want to gab while you guys want to ask us questions. But just one last point on this goes back to what the judge said about the difference between transparency and accountability. So there is, the technology stuff is great, but if you're in a well-developed kleptocracy, you can publicize bribe taking as much as you want, nothing's going to happen. In other words, there's a real limitation to, I mean, sure, people can vent and stuff like that. Where it's particularly effective is where you can think of it as an anvil and there is a hammer. So, for example, a couple of cases, one real and one potential, where it could really make a big difference. The real case is the Nigerian elections. And what you had was a bloody-minded head of the Nigerian Independent Electoral Commission who was determined to have free and fair elections. And people could feel, so he did a bunch of mechanistic changes in how, all kinds of stuff, how often you had to do your fingerprint when you were voting, and, all kinds of stuff to try to protect it. And then people were out there with their cell phones taking pictures of the initial counts. And you had him, and then you actually had the U.S. Secretary of State and the British Foreign Secretary who weighed in when there was actual intelligence of rigging of the totals, and literally made a public declaration that night saying, we know you're doing it, cut it out. And it's that combination of the technology with some kind of pressure where you really get dividends out of it.
Okay,
I won't do
I
the
see a
second.
lot of hands, so we're going to take 3 questions at once here, and hopefully we're going to get through them. So 1, 2, and 3 in the back. So this gentleman first, then Ed, and then the person in the back.
Hi, my name is Rowie Rosenblith. I'm the Executive Director of Not in My Country. We create web and mobile applications that empower people to record and report corruption. We've been working in Uganda, Kenya, and the Philippines and Ukraine more recently. Very proud to have been working with Judge Wolf on the International Anti-Corruption Court campaign for a while now. And first, I just want to make a quick thank you.
We're running out of time here, so
Sure.
we really need to make questions.
Sarah Chase, I just wanted to thank you for bringing up the topic of sextortion, and Frank Vogel. It's an issue that is very important and more people need to address. Part of the reason that we got involved in trying to fight corruption and using different tools to do so. My question is, when Judge Wolf and I met in Prague 2 years ago, this was a bit of an academic discussion. Since then, we've seen institutions like the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, CICIG, known by its Spanish acronym CICIG, actually bring down a sitting president. So an international institution under the United Nations prosecuted and investigated in a country that was being throttled by corruption and was able to accomplish that. And it was a RICO kind of incident involving customs officials, so on. Could we see, and would it fit into this campaign to bring such a thing about? Because now in El Salvador, Honduras, and in Ukraine, there's discussions about this very same structure being put in place, and could it be complementary to an international anti-corruption court?
Okay, we're going to take right behind you here. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name's Debbie Lapravad. I'm with the Century, and I've been investigating international corruption for the last 20 years as a FBI agent and now in the private NGO. The United States has been leading the corruption effort, anti-corruption effort by FCPA, by the new FBI's and DOJ's international kleptocracy efforts, along with the UK. However, beneficial ownership is one of the big pushes right now in the world of kleptocracy. And yet, I see it in Delaware, Nevada, all of the states that push to have secrecy in their incorporation, as well as all of the Channel Islands, the Isle of Man, and the BVI. Those, 5 areas are still the largest areas to maintain a level of secrecy on beneficial ownership. And so all of the kleptocrats in Ukraine, in Nigeria, I work Eastern Africa, they all still are opening Jersey corporations, Isle of Man, Delaware corporations. In Ukraine, there was a Oregon organization that was incorporated and was used to milk Ukraine for $15 million. Is there anything else that the United States can be doing to push for the United States to be the leader in getting behind beneficial ownership, and then work with our foreign partners in those 5 jurisdictions that are really still hiding the beneficial ownership?
Okay. Go to Ed, and then in the back. We'll take 4 questions here. Right here, Ed here, and then the last question is in the back.
Ed Verona with McClarty Associates.
You cited the International Criminal Court as a precedent for the creation of an International Corruption Court, and yet one of the criticisms of the ICC, the Criminal Court, is that it is selective, that we've gone after leaders of African states or other lesser powerful nations of the world, but we're not really going after some of the worst abuses because it creates complications for us. We have, in the last 2 weeks, we've seen a high-ranking U.S. senior Treasury official say that Vladimir Putin has been engaged in corrupt practices, maybe worth $40 billion, and that we've known it for years. So he said. And a week earlier, we had a prosecutor or a judge who conducted the inquest into the death of Alexander Litvinenko, and has declared that, well, in all probability, it was ordered by Vladimir Putin. And Judge Wolf mentioned the remarks that John Kerry made in Davos, but John Kerry can go to Moscow. He can meet with Vladimir Putin. He has to meet with him because there are major international issues that have to be discussed with the head of a world power, or of a major power at least. How do you reconcile the need to deal with our critical foreign policy concerns and yet apply a uniform, objective standard of justice?
Okay, and we'll take the last question in the back.
Thank you. My name is Audrey, and I'm a reporter from Voice of America. I have a question regarding the case in China. Well, China seems to have complicated criminal laws, and President Xi Jinping has been cracking down corruption among high-ranking officials, and which caught a lot of international attention. Judge Wolf just quoted Nelson Mandela as saying it is impossible until it's done, but it seems the Chinese people still feel very frustrated and hopeless. Do you think it can be done in China? And also, do you think the Fox Hunt campaign is effective? Thank you.
Okay, so we have 4 diverse questions to the panel. Let's start with the first one on the impact of
CC.
CC.
Okay, all right, I could take up at least 2 of them at once. CC is very, very interesting. CC was unique, but is now being explored as a model for emulation. The people, it's a model of international involvement in law enforcement in a particular country. It is a step toward either eliminating the necessity, in my view, of an international anti-corruption court, or a step toward the creation of one. Guatemala, virtually a failed state, certainly in terms of the administration of criminal justice, asked the UN for a partnership, and foreign judges and prosecutors come in and work with, not just as advisors, but essentially discharging official responsibilities of the government of Guatemala. So they will participate in, foreign judges will participate in judging cases, or Jose Ugaz, who courageously prosecuted Fujimori in Peru, he's acting for a while as a prosecutor in Guatemala. This is being discussed in various places as a model, for example, for Ukraine. There's a very good Economist article a couple of months ago, Look West, Ukraine. Look to the CSIG model as something transitional, or something that can address an immediate need. If I could, while I've got the microphone, address this issue, very, very well put by the gentleman from McClarty about, well, in 2 of them, the United States. We have a tremendous amount to be proud of in the United States for our leadership in fighting corruption internationally, FCPA, the OECD Convention Against Bribery, companies like GE, among others. But we have far from a perfect and uniformly proud record. One of the criticisms, I think valid criticisms, of the International Criminal Court is that we've effectively frustrated its ability to proceed against countries which are our strategic allies in other areas. And that discredits any administration of justice when targets of prosecution are selected based on or influenced by whether they're the friend or enemy of somebody who can influence, in our case, I think through the Security Council, whether there'll be a prosecution. In addition, there is an urgent challenge with regard to improving transparency of beneficial ownership in the United States. This was the subject of the Global Witness undercover operation that was on 60 Minutes the other night. It's sort of a function of our federal system. We don't have national incorporation of companies, so there are laws of 50 states, and you need to perhaps change the laws in 50 states, which could be done by a federal law that would preempt all other state laws, but it would be a radical change in the historic nature of the way businesses are organized in the United States. But it really injures our leadership when we're one of the havens. When I just started talking about the International Criminal Court, I was at the World Economic Forum, and I mentioned Switzerland, and a Swiss fellow said to me, we're much better now on bank transparency and beneficial ownership than you are. You ought to be careful about what you say in this area. So I think you raised an important point.
Moving over to that question about beneficial ownerships, and does the fight against corruption begin in Delaware? Brackett, maybe you can comment.
I doubt it, but at least a big step can be taken in Delaware. Those of you who saw 60 Minutes, you'll recall that Senator Levin, there was a passage with Senator Levin there, and he talked about a bill that he supported for a long time that got nowhere in Congress. And this will be an unorthodox view from the corporate side of things. But I think it's kind of a no-brainer about the disclosure of beneficial interest. I think, one, what's the big deal? There's a bit of a privacy concern, but we all know that the reason that that you can obscure beneficial ownership is for hiding tax things and other things. It's rarely for a benign reason. Second, what's the big harm? No, there's not a big harm. Three, how can the U.S. be a leader if they don't live up to principles of transparency and connected to accountability about those kinds of things? So I think it's a no-brainer.
Anyone else want to comment on the question of
that one? Yeah, I'd just love to in two regards. One is Prime Minister David Cameron is going to host an anti-corruption summit in May, and I think we should all tune into this. And a number of us have been in conversations with his team about, how to make this a real game changer. And I know a number of people have said start at home. If you start with a major initiative on BVI and British Overseas Territories, that will really turn the world upside down. But the last thing I'd like to say, and in general, is here we are, all of us speaking in official capacities, but I think there has to be a kind of social demand on this. And that means, the citizens of the United States have to start getting embarrassed about the use of our territory for the hiding of criminal proceeds. The citizens of the United States have to stand up when a governor of New York City says, I want every billionaire in the world to buy property in New York. Well, not every billionaire in the world got his or her money legally, right? So I have to say as a New Yorker, wait a second, I don't want the economy of my city to be floated on dirty money. And it means that just as some of us might consider not buying certain articles of clothing from a company that might be, known to be using sweatshops in you name the country, maybe we should start considering taking our money out of banks that are well known to be participating in this kind of activity, or maybe to highlight the activities of certain lawyers in essentially providing corruption services to the kleptocrats of other countries. Because at that point, back to my analogy of criminal networks, some of our very respected people in this society are actually parts of these criminal networks. And it's time for us, I think, as Americans to acknowledge that.
And the last question was dealing with China, and Frank's going to touch upon that, and that will be the segue to kind of closing comments and last thoughts. Okay, yes.
Right.
But by the way, just on that last thing, if you haven't seen the 60 Minutes show, you can get it online. It's called Anonymous. And if you haven't seen that, just go to Global Witness's website because they have the full story and it's great stuff. China. That's a terrifically important question. Interesting enough, we have a national chapter in China. There are many people in China who are trying very hard to push the envelope of anti-corruption. The government's response, as you know, has been both enormously positive. A lot of very corrupt people have been prosecuted. On the other hand, the government has clamped down a lot on lawyers who try to protect people for human rights, on human rights advocates, most recently on women's rights advocates, and we need to see all of this together. It's enormously complicated. China has agreed under the G20 to an anti-corruption action program that hasn't got nearly enough publicity around the world. We have, therefore, the public comments from China and the public agreements from China to do much more on anti-corruption, and we now need to try to build international pressure to hold their feet to the fire. The last point I'd make about China is that I think there is an enormous amount at stake in this corruption field in China. In fact, I think President Xi's success or failure will depend on how far he goes in this anti-corruption fight. So far, we don't quite know whether it's political or whether it's genuine. But the public support for anti-corruption measures in China, by everything that my colleagues in China tell me, is increasing tremendously.
Just in closing, I would say that I certainly want to associate myself with the remarks of the whole panel. There's nothing that I'm in disagreement with. I think Frank lays out a challenge in the index. The United States is all the way down in a 16th place tie here, or 19, I guess.
No, 60.
Yeah, my glasses on. But, we ought to be seeking to be at the top of that list. And so what are those steps? And I think, what's that agenda consist of? And I think that's a good challenge for all of us who are active at the national level. I would say at the state level, there was a mention made earlier. We talked about Boston mayor, and I mentioned Detroit, and state capitals were mentioned. But the role of the media. It is interesting in 2016 that we probably have less coverage today of government at any level than we've ever had. It is astounding. When I started in the legislature in Michigan in the 70s, all of the Detroit stations had television bureaus. The major newspapers had bureaus with multiple people involved. There was an AP, there was a UPI, there were other regional papers that even had reporters. Today, that's all gone. All of that has been lost in the newspaper world and the media world generally. And there's an AP reporter, I think, that remains, who picks up the releases that the government writes and gives to them. Investigative reporting is almost gone. And that's why, and it's gone not just in capitals, but it's gone in many of the metropolitan areas as well. And that's why you could have what you had going on in Detroit going on. Frankly, this terrible story about Flint, had there been any coverage going on, those complaints from citizens started in 2015 mid-year. But who could they talk to and who was covering that? And so it strikes me that this is blog posts aren't going to get it done on this one, and something, a Twitter feed. And when you've got a presidential candidate, as one noticeable one mentioned at times, why he gives to candidates, he said, well, he does that so he can have his access in both parties. He said they're both the same, and he treated that, they're all incredibly stupid, I guess, and I guess that's why they take the money. But I do think that there is a challenge that we've got, and I do not know the answer for this, because I happen to think investigative reporting it can be very, very good, and we just don't have very much of it today.
Okay. Judge Wolf, why don't we throw it over to you for last comments in terms of the discussion today and your proposal and your ideas and how the discussion has maybe reflects your opening comments as well.
Sure. I thank the Wilson Center for convening this. and for working with me to attract a panel of people who can so seriously contribute to this urgent discussion. I thank the panelists. Everybody is very knowledgeable and very busy. I learned a lot, and it's gratifying to see that the priority that people of this quality give to this issue. I may have said this before. I've said it in other contexts. Sometimes I feel like I'm in the emperor's new clothes. I see this gaping hole in many nations and in the international system for using criminal law. And this panel today has had I've done a lot of programs. None have been as sophisticated or informative to me particularly is this one. So I'm very grateful for that, and I'm grateful for both the number and the quality of the people I know who are in the audience, having seen the RSVP list. Evidently, you share the understanding that this issue of corruption, it's not just something off to the side and one of many issues. It's fundamental, and if you think of almost any issue around the world on which we would like to see improvement, corruption, particularly grand corruption, frustrates the possibility of achieving progress. So I hope, like me, you'll all go out continuing to think about this, continue to think about what you and the people associated with you can do about it, and from my particular perspective, think about how the criminal law can be employed to make a more effective contribution, either through advocating the creation of the court that I advocate, but also, maybe not either, also in other ways. But thank you all very much.
Thank you, and I want to echo Judge Wolf's comments. It was really just a very informative panel, a really very lively discussion. I felt I learned a lot as well during this discussion, and it's really something that the Wilson Center is going to be actively engaged in going forward. This question not only of corruption, but broader rule of law issues, both on a global level and on a regional level, are really issues that we're going to continue to address. So again, thank all the panelists, and thank you for coming.
Well done.
And I certainly, parsed the chips and found nothing happening, but we didn't even have as much to